Hi, Scott Heron here for the next stage of the Climate Vulnerability Index assessment, which is looking at the community vulnerability. Just as a reminder, the CVI process is a values-based, science-driven and community-focused rapid assessment tool. And we'll be touching on some of those points as we go through the presentation. If we look backwards for a moment, the CVI webinar series for Kilwa Kisiwani has already discussed climate stresses upon the World Heritage values, science-driven. The key values for the property, values-based, and the assessments of the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity relating to the key climate stresses. And this all relates to the first part of the CVI framework. And you can see that shown here, the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity terms, which together lead to an assessment of the OUV vulnerability. In this next phase, we look at the community vulnerability, considering the economic, social, and cultural components. Collectively, this is the CVI process. To start off with, we're looking at an analysis of the economic, social, and cultural connections, and we consider those individually. The first of these is the economic consideration. We look at the business types directly associated with the World Heritage property. The second part of this assessment is looking at the social interactions. We consider the locals, the domestic visitors, and the international visitors who use or have visited the property. The third component is the cultural identity. It considers all types of cultural connections, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, with the World Heritage property. One thing that we've found extremely helpful is developing a scenario, a particular future scenario for how we assess economic, social, and cultural effects. To give some examples of this in the past, Shark Bay, Western Australia, made an assessment in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe. And the three key climate stresses identified for that property were extreme temperature events, notably in the marine environment, storm intensity and frequency, and an air temperature increase. And so for this scenario, looking forwards, the workshop group there made the decision to look at a frequency of extreme temperature events occurring 5 times per decade based on scientific projections, a doubling of the frequency of severe storms, again based on projections, and then air temperature increase by 1 degree Celsius, also based on those IPCC forecasts, projections. In the north of Scotland, the heart of Neolithic Orkney looked in a different way. It looked at three of the key components of the property and considered major impacts on those that would then link across to the community. So in that case, it was coastal impacts at Skara Brae, a Neolithic settlement, the groundwater table increase at Maze How, a burial chamber, and the walking path around the ring of Brodgar, a stone circle, becoming inaccessible. And they were linked to the 3 key climate stresses that had been identified for that property: sea level rise, storm intensity and frequency, and precipitation trend. For the Wadden Sea analysis, again, this reflected on the climate projections for the 3 identified key climate stresses: sea level rise, an increase of about 32 centimeters in the time frame of consideration to 2050, sea temperature trend increasing by close to 1 degree Celsius, and extreme temperature events having a 2 to 10-fold increase in frequency. For the economics, as I mentioned, we consider the business types that are associated with the World Heritage property. And some broad examples of these business types might be in the areas of tourism or specific events, festivals, if you like, goods and services provided by the property, government institutions or education and research areas, sectors, And conservation and non-government organisations also contribute to the economic value associated with the property. For these, the relevant business types, we like to compile representative information about them. So this might include the estimated economic value, the number of people who are engaged, but it would certainly include an assessment of the level of reliance upon the World Heritage values. So here are some examples of some of that background information. Tourism included components like guided tours or accommodation and day visits in this application to the Wadden Sea. And there were some notes in there about the different values and different economic estimates that were provided. You'll see also there's a column graph here, which is considering, based on a number of contributions from workshop participants, how reliant this particular industry is upon the World Heritage values. And for tourism, it was considered to be of high reliance upon the World Heritage values. Another example is for fisheries, also from the Wadden Sea, where there are several different types of different fishery there. And you can see that once again, there's a reasonably high level of reliance upon the World Heritage property. And you can see here also the estimates of the number of people involved and the economic valuations. A third example is from Edinburgh. The old and new towns of Edinburgh World Heritage property, where events, including festivals, conferences and sporting events, was considered to be a business type that was closely related to the values of the World Heritage property. And you can see here again in the column chart, there's an assessment of a high degree of reliance upon the World Heritage values and also the estimates of the economic information. For Edinburgh, there were 8 different economic sectors that were selected, and you can see in these charts, some of which you've already seen, the range of reliance upon the World Heritage values. Tourism and events down the bottom end here, having the highest reliance, coming back to finance and legal business types not having a very high dependence upon the World Heritage values. And so this was an assessment made by a variety of workshop participants. The second of the ESC, or community vulnerability components, is social. And here again, we look at the locals, the domestic visitors and international visitors. And the important part here is that they must have had an interaction with the property. When we look at our social interactions, we can dive a little bit deeper into some of the social science literature and give some direction about how to select the assessments in this section. So here we consider separately the locals, the domestic and international tourists who come to visit the property area. And the assessment of the social adaptive capacity can be informed by considering categories of social capital, those that relate to the society, the community, human capital, personal connections, built capital, so this is assets or attributes of the property, and the natural capital, environmental aspects. So if you're not familiar with the term capital, then consider the term attributes. So the attributes of society, the attributes of individual people, the demographics, attributes of the buildings, attributes of the environment. We do also pose some questions with the workshop, typically, to ask about some key questions. How important socially, how important to the society are the physical assets within the World Heritage properties, for example, buildings and infrastructure. And this links across to those built capital or built attribute aspects. And you can see the other questions here. How important socially is the property for collective health and lifestyle satisfaction? How important is the interaction with the natural environment? And how important are the cohesion of society or cooperative actions relating to the property? The final component of the community vulnerability assessment is the cultural connections. And as mentioned previously, these can be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, so longer history or more recent history. And again, we look at three different groups: locals, domestics, and internationals. However, because this is about identity, it doesn't actually require a physical use or a physical visit to the property. And that's an important distinction for this component. Cultural identity, as mentioned, doesn't need to have that. But again, looking at the social science literature, we can use these four different categories to help inform the CVI assessment in this area. So there are some aspects of culture that are environment focused. And you can see some examples there in the brackets. There are some that are very much people focused. They're related to the welfare of others. There's some aspects that we might consider very self-focused in terms of identity, our self-interest, our own lifestyle, our own personal wealth. And there are some that we might consider as pleasure-focused. So these are intangible pleasures that could be derived through spiritual or aesthetic opportunities. Once again, we pose some questions to the workshop group and seek responses. And so here, for example, how important culturally, how important to identity is pride in the property or attachment to the place? How important is it for a person's own identity and self-interest? How important for the artistic, spiritual, aesthetic, and cultural opportunities? And how important is the appreciation of the environment within the World Heritage property? And again, this is linking across to the cultural identity. So here you can see we have these three different areas: economic, social, and cultural. If I can, for a moment, give you one example to link across. There is a World Heritage property in the centre of Australia. It's centred around Uluru. Many people know that as Ayers Rock. But Uluru is a key part of Australian culture, of Australian identity. Now, the only time that I have visited Uluru was when I was a very small child. In fact, I spent the whole time in my grandmother's arms. So whilst I have, as an Australian, a cultural connection to this large rock in the middle of Australia, I do not have a social connection. I haven't interacted with the property, and I don't have any connection in that way. In terms of economics, there's also businesses that operate tours and examples there for the economic section. So that's just one example of how these three different areas can be considered and linked together. When we consider these, we look at the dependency of each, and that considers the future effect of a potential loss of World Heritage values due to key climate stresses on each of these components. We also do an assessment of the adaptive capacity, and that's the capacity that currently exists to adapt in the face of a loss of World Heritage values due to the key climate stresses. So once again, here is the entire CVI framework, and the pieces that we've been speaking about today have been the lower part of this, the economic, social, and cultural aspects that lead us to an assessment for the ESC dependency and the ESC adaptive capacity. And through doing that, combined with the OUV vulnerability, we arrive at an assessment for the community vulnerability.